Hello and welcome to the Holocaust Museum and Cohen Education Center's Teachers Workshop Series. This is session number 3, and this is on Mexico and the Mexican Revolution. My name is Sam Parrish. I'm Director of Operations and Educational Specialist at the Holocaust Museum and Cohen Education Center, and it's my pleasure to be the facilitator for this workshop series. The series is on session 3, and it will be going for at least a year, probably a year and a half, covering the topic of genocide. Before we get into into the material itself, I do want to thank, as always, the Commissioner's Task Force on Holocaust Education, also known as the Florida Task Force, for their unwavering and continual support in helping Holocaust centers educate teachers so they can then cascade that information onto their students. Likewise, I'd like to thank the Mural Color Educator Series for exactly the same thing, unwavering, constant support, and the goal always being to help teachers so they can then teach their students. So big thanks to both of these organizations who've been with us and continue to be with us and continue to be the engine that powers Teachers Workshops. So again, this is Teachers Workshop Series number 3. In the first, we looked at, in session 1, we looked at an introduction on genocide and then what we're calling mass human rights violations. This is the place to go. It is the United Nations website and contains some pretty thorough definitions. So the first, of course, since this is a Teachers Workshop Series on genocide and other mass human rights violations, we start with genocide. The definitions, if you were here for the first session, you can always go back and look at the session since it's archived. But if you notice, it's pretty substantial. The key for our purposes is that these acts are committed with an intent to destroy. And as it says, in whole or part, and here's the key for genocide: national, ethnic or ethnical, racial, or religious group. So it's group. That is the idea in terms of genocide. We will see overlap between genocide and these other mass human rights violations. Genocide is broken down neatly for us as opposed to the other ones. So it is the killing of members of a group, a specifically targeted group, causing damage, whether it be mental or physical, the deliberate inflicting of conditions that are designed to destroy, ideally, from their perspective, to destroy in whole or part a group, again, a national, ethnic, racial, religious group. I think political group could be in there as well, and maybe it's built into the national part. To impose measures to prevent births within a group and then to forcibly transfer. So we referenced some of these for the Holocaust. We referenced some of these for the Cambodian Genocide, which was session 2. And I suspect we're going to see this moving forward for some of these different mass human rights violations. So the UN's website is very good for these definitions. You can see it breaks it down, what a mental element and physical element is, and so forth. For our purposes, we went over genocide and looked at the specific violations that we just did, the intent, and so forth. So we have a background on that. In session 1, we built up the creation of the actual term with Raphael Lemkin, the genesis of that term, and so forth. So if you haven't done session 1, I invite you to go back and look at it. You don't have to see it in order to do session 3, but there's information in there that might be of help to you. All right, the second definition that we looked at was crimes against humanity. If you look, crimes against humanity, and then it breaks it down, section 1, A through K, these are the specific elements. Section 2, more elements, the physical and mental elements of the crime, the context, and so forth. So this is very, very broad. Again, for our purposes, what we're looking at is here, that it is that these acts are committed as part of a widespread or systematic attack against a specific targeted civilian population. So that's where this gets differentiated from war crimes. This is attacking specifically civilians who are not involved in a war footing. War crimes then makes sense. Again, another substantial definition. War crimes are violations of laws that are generally applicable, I think, internationally in terms of armed conflict. And this is specific to targeting people within the context of war, whether it is civilians or soldiers, it is in that context. So you can see how there's a bleed over from genocide to crimes against humanity to war crimes as well. So it makes defining these a little bit confusing, actually. And the last one we looked at was ethnic cleansing. As I've said in both of them, ethnic cleansing is not actually recognized. It's not therefore legally binding. Each time I've said that I think we know inside what ethnic cleansing is, and there are a couple of definitions. One is to render an area, a physical geographic area, ethnically homogeneous, and that's through force, intimidation, removal of people from that area. A second working definition is to purposefully create or design policy by one ethnic group to remove another ethnic group through violence, through terror of that group. So we have a feel for it. It's not internationally recognized. The last three that we looked at, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and ethnic cleansing, comprise for our purposes what we'll refer to as mass human rights violations. The other thing that we did, one of the other things that we did in session one was to look at the types of governance. There's a list that's located in section one: democracy, socialism, communism, nationalism, patriotism, dictatorship, authoritarian, words like that, all taken from Merriam's dictionary, so we're on the same page. And we looked at those different types of governance because we're going to apply them to the different leaders, which we did with the Cambodian, and I've got done for the Mexican Revolution period as well. We determined, I think it was in session two, we determined that the type of governance, whether it's considered in today's parlance left or right, is less important than the idea of the overarching idea of totalitarianism. And that's the kind of one of the keys that we were looking at, was the presence or the propensity, I guess, for a system of governance to become totalitarian. That's what we're looking at more so than the left-right paradigm. Although I have added a left-right paradigm column that we'll see at the end of this talk. So we see it in today's language, and actually, hopefully, so we see that both sides are represented. I don't know if evenly, but they're both represented. So we see right-wing systems of governance involved in genocide and mass human rights violations, and we see left-wing systems involved in genocide and mass human rights violations. Therefore, hopefully telling us that that isn't what's important. What is important is the concept of totalitarianism. We also attributed the number of deaths specifically to that system of governance and the specific leader when possible. It was easier to do with the Cambodian genocide due to the more modern timing of it. With Cambodia, it was 1975 to 1979, although we went back to about 1970 to 79. With Mexico and the Mexican Revolution, we're looking at 1900 to 1920. Therefore, record keeping is going to be totally different. So it's going to be a little bit more difficult to apply numbers of deaths to specific leaders. We will, at the end, certainly have a number, though, to apply, never forgetting that these numbers represent individual human beings. All right. Another thing that emerged in the second, the Cambodian genocide talk, and I think we may see emerge in this as well, is something even, I don't know, simpler than totalitarianism, and that is a basic lack of respect for human life. It's actually shocking. So I started to question, and maybe we'll broach that in here, maybe that'll come out here, is totalitarianism or these specific types of governance, did they lead to this general lack of respect for human life, or is the system of governance actually a symptom of a society that lacks respect for human life? So we can kind of look at that as well. If it is the latter, it's a little bit scary because that covers the gambit of different types of governance. So in other words, if societies lack respect for human life and generate a left or a right wing type of governance, but it still leads to genocide and mass human rights violations, that's a concern. So therefore, it's not a political thinking. It's more based than that, and that's a little bit more than a little bit frightening. All right, so again, very difficult to apply specific numbers to specific leaders, to specific time periods when we're talking this, the lead up to, and then the Mexican Revolution itself. It's virtually impossible to do that. There was a lot of instability. Interestingly, there was actually a long period of stability that broke down and led to instability. Throughout, there was a paucity of record keeping, that's for sure. But as we get into the Mexican Revolution, we see intrigue, political machinations, drama, and kind of behind the scenes kind of king making and the deposition of kings as well. So in terms of stability, it kind of blows up by about 1910, it really does. And so in terms of record keeping, forget it. Plus, at the time, Mexico was still emerging as a kind of a modern nation, and therefore the record keeping was maybe not as stellar as it would be today. So difficult to apply numbers to specifics, but anyway, we will try our best to do so. We do have some good large numbers that we can apply and sort of try to parse up a little bit. It is a kind of a mishmash of record keeping, and keep in mind, of course, as well, that there was a lot of remote territory outside of Mexico City and some of the other hubs that was extremely remote. And we'll see a photograph that kind of gives us an idea of what life was like back then and how seemingly, old-fashioned is the term for it, to say the least. Another thing that makes applying the numbers difficult is there were coups, revolutions, and civil wars, plural, and therefore the context is difficult. Were the killings done during war, and therefore were they legitimate, in quotes, legitimate war deaths? Were they war crimes? So that's also difficult to parse. So the numbers are hard to deal with, are hard to pinpoint for sure. Something else that emerged during the session 2, the Cambodian session, that will also see plays something of a role here in the Mexican Revolution, though much smaller, is the idea of race. It actually in Cambodia, if you did the session, if not, we saw that the darker skinned Khmer people actually looked down upon their lighter skinned countrymen and the neighboring countries. So Laos and Thailand, and especially Vietnam, they really looked down on, but they also looked down on the lighter skinned Chinese as well. So they saw that their darker complexion was an indication of a more superior race. So we saw race was important in the Cambodian genocide, and we'll see that it does play something of a role in this one, though much, much less. I think we'll see a different impetus for what we see as the lead up to and then the Mexican Revolution. Definitely there was also a lack of respect for religious adherence. We saw that in Cambodia for sure, with expunging their own, although maybe not legally called the state religion. It was a religion that was 90+%. It was Buddhism. And so we saw them expunge Buddhism. We saw the Khmer Rouge go after the Muslim minority that was there. They also went after Catholics and other groups as well. So there was a lack of respect for religious adherence. And not sure if that's connected to the lack of respect for human life or vice versa, but it's there. And so again, the Mexican Revolution, we see race play something of a role, although I think what is more prevalent here is the idea of land ownership, and therefore it's more of an economic than racial or ethnic impetus for this. Nevertheless, it did happen. Although I believe there are elements of the concept of ethnic cleansing. So we'll see that with Mexican Indians, the Yaqui and the Mayan people. We'll see something specifically against them that is based on ethnicity/race. We'll see another, we'll take a little detour for something that's really kind of interesting, and it is the a racial cleansing, the conceptualization of racial cleansing in something called the Plan of San Diego. And there was actually the Plan of San Diego 1, 2, and 3, different iterations of it. But the idea behind it was to propose a race war in the United States. It actually backfired, but we'll look into that. That's actually very interesting. Politically, we will see socialist, liberal, lowercase l, anarchist, populist, agrarian movements, a revolution, and then again, civil war, but there's numerous civil wars going on simultaneously. We'll see the Socialist Party of the United States and the United States government, which in Cambodia we refer to as imperialist. And I think at this time there was elements for sure of imperialism as well. We see capitalist interests as well from the United States, and therefore we see kind of, again, that broad range, that continuum from left to right, as we would see it today. Another thing that's interesting that we'll see is Germany's involvement in 1917. This is the Zimmermann telegram when that came to light. And the question was, the Zimmermann telegram and the concept behind it, was that inspired by the Plan of San Diego? A lot going on. In short, this is an extremely tumultuous time period. This is leading up to World War I, and this is in a country that's extremely unstable. The last thing that stands out is the tragic level of creativity and ingenuity when it comes to, of all things, torture and murder. It is shocking. Like Cambodia, it is off-putting, to say the least. So this is a graphic warning alert, and I would certainly preview the material if you're going to use this with students. All right, so on to the Mexican Revolution. We start with this screen, which is actually screen number 3, and kind of a neat picture here. This is a drawing by an early to mid 1900s Mexican artist, Miguel Covarrubias. Yeah, apologies. Interesting. Solderas. See, no shoes, dresses. These are obviously women fighting alongside a man. Soldaderas were also known as Los Adelitas. Women soldiers. These are women soldiers who fought during the Mexican Revolution. Now, they sometimes served in traditional roles, such as nurses or wives or women doing domestic type of activities. But as you can see here by this drawing, they also fought alongside males. Some fought so well that they were promoted to ranks of cornelis or generales, colonels and generals, although I don't know if that actually denotes what in the US military would be colonels and generals, but certainly had rank. Some disguised themselves as males. So for example, there was a woman named Angela Jimenez, and became Angel Jimenez or Angel Jimenez. So from Angela to Angel. And Angela/Angel built his reputation by threatening anyone who attempted to seduce her. Another interesting character, a soldaderas, was Petra Herrera, who became Pedro Herrera. So an easy switch of the name. Petra/Pedro gained respect through raw intelligence, through valor, and through her ability to destroy bridges. Became quite the skill. Another interesting character, Amelia Robles, became Emilio Robles. So that's an easy change of the A to the O. Robles is an interesting character because in today's terms, I think we would refer to him as transgender, because Amelia lived as Emilio, not just during the Mexican Revolution, but for the remainder of, now I will say, his life until he died. So he is an interesting character, Emilio, a transgender revolutionary soldadera. Amelia/as Emilio used masculine mannerisms, expressed machismo, was aggressive, was even a womanizer, was physically skilled with guns, was gifted as a horse rider. I mean, very masculine. Another character, Hermilia Galindo, was considered a feminist. Dolores Jimenez Muro, I'm sure it's Muro, became a colonel, so that coronelis, and was part of Emiliano Zapata's inner circle. Juana Gutierrez de Mendoza was also a colonel. And Carmen Robles, Carmen Amelia Flores, and Limbania Fernandez all became colonels, and they were all dressed as men. So right off the bat, screen number one, we haven't even gotten into the material, but what a fascinating potential activity that could be done. On researching these revolutionaries, it would shed light on Mexican history. It would also shed light on women in history, women in in non-traditional roles as well. So, I mean, that could be something for an activity. I think that would be of interest. The idea of this Los Adelitas is another thing that's kind of interesting. It emerged, actually, the soldaderas became nicknamed the Los Adelitas, and that emerged from a ballad called La Adelita. And it was about one of these soldiers who was, of course, both pretty and brave. And it was important, I think, that they brought in the feminine element, and therefore she was pretty. I think that was important to that culture at the time. Certainly was the comeliness of this La Adelita. The image that emerged, that grew from there and became actually global, of the Los Adelitas, was that they were sultry to the point of scandalous. So of course it brings in that kind of that feminine element, which kind of counters the whole point of the masculine side of it. We've got a link in the session 3 folder, and it is for the song Las Adelitas. The lyrics are there. It is in English and Spanish, so it's already translated. It's a long song. It's 6 minutes long, but there is incredible imagery, amazing photographs, and film, probably from a movie or two that came afterwards. The beginning of the revolution itself. So here is our first character, Porfirio Diaz. This quote is reminiscent of the Holocaust. It is reminiscent of Cambodia. And this is a direct quote from Diaz. "It was better that a little blood should be shed, that much blood should be saved. The blood that was shed was bad blood. The blood that was saved was good blood." So in the first sentence, we have justification. In the second sentence, we have that idea of good blood and bad blood, which we see in Cambodia, we see in the Holocaust as well. We see that concept of blood carrying good and superior versus blood that carries bad and inferior. It seems to be a common theme. Diaz, he acquired his power through a coup. The president at the time was Sebastian Lerdo de Tejada. Diaz ran the government from 1876 to 1910. So that gives us stability. That's a long time, 34 years, if I'm doing that math right, of stability. He ran the country as a dictator with an authoritarian rule. And yet it was to a degree, it was mild. Speech was free, press was free, but there were limits placed on them. And the limits weren't necessarily placed on those freedoms by Diaz or his government, but through kind of an intimidation and inference. So the people inferred that if they didn't self-censor their speech, if they didn't self-censor what they wrote in the press, that they could become targets of Diaz and the Diaz government. All right, so what was Diaz all about? Well, he tried to conciliate the Catholic Church, landowners, and big business in order to develop Mexico economically. So he wanted to promote foreign investment and foreign ownership as well. And that was done by transferring land from public holding to private holding. It helped concentrate land for more, quote, efficient usage. And it was the idea of modernizing Mexico. So here you see a bird's eye view of that time period of Mexico City. We see the National Palace. We see General Diaz's suite, which is right here. So very modern looking city. You have a bandstand here where music was played daily, and you have the town hall over here. So very modern looking city. You have horse-drawn carriages, but you also have trolleys. You have buildings several floors high. What you don't see in this picture, interestingly, is a windmill over here that got cropped out and so forth. So it was kind of a melding of or emerging of a modern city, and that is what that's what Diaz was looking to do. But it came at an expense. We said transferring land from the public land to private holdings, but it wasn't to the average people. Because of his land policy, 5,000 indigenous communities were deprived of land, but not just land, their ancestral land. And that may have actually caused in those communities as many as 1 million people to lose their land. Now, we talked about Diaz and this idea of modernization. This is what Diaz wanted, modern. Therefore, investment from foreign investors, especially Americans. The reality, and also in support of what I said earlier about record keeping, this is the reality. So here you have, I believe these are Yaqui, Y-A-Q-U-I Indians, and Mayan Indians. These are Yaqui men riding a stagecoach. So you get that feeling. We're talking about such a difference between this modernization here and what's on the outskirts of the cities here. People living in really rudimentary construction with rudimentary food gathering and food preparation implements. And this is like subsistence living. And there's a little cat. All right, but anyway, we have 5,000 communities losing their land. We have as many as 1 million people. So this is a real conflict between the traditional and the old, and the modern and the new. To give you an idea, or to give me an idea, give us an idea, there were about, in 1895, there was a census that was taken, and there were 12.7 million residents in Mexico. So that's 1895. 15 years later, in 1910, there were fewer than 3,000 families that possessed half of Mexico's land. So 3,000 families owned half of Mexico. If that 1895 population carried through, there was no growth, there was no loss. It was 12.7 million residents. Out of 12.7 million residents, 3,000 own half of the country's physical land, actual land. And the other half, much of the other half, was uninhabitable. And so we're talking about land kind of like this, which is sort of desert-like. So that shows a inequality, to say the least, right? So we can see how what could emerge from here is not so much a racial animus or an ethnic animus, although that will come out to a degree. It's more about economics and land. 95% of the rural population, people who lived in the country, actually owned no land at all. Almost half of those people who were considered rural lived on haciendas, a large farming or ranching estate or plantation. The haciendas encompassed 80% of the rural communities. So you've got people who are living out in a rural area, and yet they don't own land. Where were they? They were living on haciendas. Okay, so then what is the makeup of haciendas? Well, let's look at an example. One family in the state of Chihuahua held 6 million acres. 6 million acres for one family. One family, or rather another family in central Mexico, needed a 1-day plus train journey to cross their land. That's how substantial their holdings were. This is enormous. So that's hacienda. Instead, therefore, of land ownership by individuals, you had individuals living on haciendas, and you had forced labor. So that's something we saw, forced labor. We saw in the Cambodian Genocide. We certainly know of it from the Holocaust. And one example that gets used is Valle Nacional. I'm sure I'm wrecking that one too. Valle, Valle Nacional, Nacional. So slave labor, or forced labor, but really it's slavery when we think about it. So there were 3 different conditions or 3 different ways, forms of slavery that existed. So there was a tactic. The tactic was to enslave workers. How? As forced laborers and slaves. So what would they do? The hacienda owners, in cahoots with government officials, as we'll see, would lend money in advance to a person. Now, it was probably a small amount, but it was something that couldn't be repaid back because the wages that one received working in general, or maybe was compensated for on the hacienda, was not enough. Plus, people who were on the haciendas were generally forced to purchase from the company store. In fact, they were often paid in tokens or coupons that could only be used at the company store. So this is a circular situation. Now, it sounds like it could be a spiral that was difficult to get out of, and that's absolutely the case, but not just for the individual. Debt was actually inherited. So a son would inherit the debt of his father, and therefore the forced labor status. If one decided to attempt to escape, runaway slaves or runaway forced laborers were sought by the police, and those who were caught were whipped publicly up to, up to and including death. That's one way of using forced labor or slavery. A second was to enslave workers as peons, P-E-O-N-S, peons, and this is through the system of peonage. So an indebted person was called an enganchado, E-N-G-A-N-C-H-A-D-O, enganchado. Peonage was a person was bound, a debtor was bound to the lender or the creditor until until they paid off their debt through labor. But like we saw, very difficult to pay it off, so it was a spiral that continued. There were cultural aspects that made this idea of peonage more difficult to get out of. So for example, when a baptism occurred, a celebration, a fiesta was required. At the fiesta, a priest was required, and liquor alcohol was supposed to be supplied as well. This is all by the father, the family that was celebrating the baptism. And so one of the only ways that one back then there could pay for a fiesta, pay for the priest to be in attendance, to provide liquor for attendees, was by pledging their future labor and therefore becoming a peon. Other examples, children's clothes. If you needed to purchase your child's first clothes, maybe. If you needed to purchase tools for your work, if you needed to pay for a wedding, to pay for the birth of the baby, etc. These were all occurrences that led to peonage. And as you can see, these aren't extra superb or surprising or unusual events. We're talking about buying clothes, buying tools, paying for a wedding and the birth of a baby, and therefore the baptism of the baby. These are very general, typical things. And so therefore peonage was almost kind of guaranteed in a way. Ultimately, if a worker was in debt as a peon, they really had no rights. And this did not discriminate between the native indigenous Indians or the Mexican citizen. It didn't matter. If a person was in debt, they had no rights. Now, not all of the haciendas were bad. Some were treated paternally, and that kind of sounds a little bit reminiscent of America's slave period up into the 1860s, with this idea of a paternal way of managing the slave state. Even in that situation, though, paternal, spare the rod, spoil the child. So even in a paternal peonage, forced labor, slave hacienda, people who went against the rules were whipped. So bad behavior was resulted in whipping. It was horrible. It was fair, however, in their minds. However, on the bad haciendas, peons, for example, usually lived short lives. They would be whipped for various infractions. Slaves were considered easier to acquire than animals, so slaves were treated worse than animals. In other words, they were cheaper to replace. It was easier to get a person and treat them badly than an animal. When a peon was beaten to death, the authorities just looked the other way. It didn't merit anything. In the Yucatan Peninsula, way down in the south, workers on a plantation for a plant called henequen or henequen, 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 worked in chains. They were often actually deported from other parts of Mexico as well. So now we have that idea of deportation and forced labor. That sounds an awful lot like the Holocaust and similar to the Cambodian genocide that we've seen. So we're seeing trends start to emerge here already. On these bad plantations, these haciendas, women were often sexually assaulted. Apparently the prettier ones were often kept or forced to be concubines. So we have essentially sex slavery, sexual assault, which are absolutely covered in crimes against humanity. So we see violations emerging already, and we're in between 1900 and 1910. Food, as we generally see, whether it be the Holocaust or the Cambodian genocide thus far, we've seen insufficient nutrition. Also clothing. There was generally no change of clothing for these peons. Bathing facilities were rare. Sanitation was primitive. Disease, exposure, and exhaustion all took their toll. And I could very well be speaking about the Holocaust. I could be very well speaking about the Cambodian genocide when I say disease, exposure, and exhaustion taking their toll. An American journalist named John Turner, interesting character. He went to Mexico. He went to Mexico to do an investigative report about the Mexican slavery situation in the 20th century. He actually went under the guise of being an American investor. And so he was able to gain entry to different haciendas, to gain access to different people to speak with who were higher up in that hierarchy. And they were, of course, more free with what they talked about, had they known he was an investigative reporter. Upon speaking with a foreman on one of the haciendas or plantations, a man, a foreman, when in reference to speaking about forced labor, says, as a quote, "When you've got them, they're yours and have to do with them what you do. If they don't, you can kill them. So you've got them. And if they don't behave, if they don't follow your orders, you have carte blanche to kill them." Turner's articles, I mean, that's just one of the many quotes. He spent a couple years there doing this research. His articles, he sent out articles, as you can see here. In the American magazine, we have this Barbarous Mexico that became the book Barbarous Mexico, or I suppose Mexico Barbaro. It's interesting because Turner was trying to expose the economic situation, the taking advantage of the people. We'll see his background, where that comes from. He was a strong proponent of socialism, and yet he, as much as he found a fraternity, I suppose, with the Mexican people, for some reason he hated the Chinese who were Chinese nationals who were in Mexico at the time. A third tactic. So we talked about forced labor, slavery, and peonage, but there's another approach, and that is chattel slavery. This is generally with poor Indians, poor indigenous Mexican natives, and others. They were often enticed to sign a contract to work on a hacienda or plantation, or perhaps they were jailed for a crime that was completely fabricated. So a local police officer, or the town's leader, like a mayor, was called the jefe politico, would drum up a crime and arrest someone, so they could serve their time in jail, or they could work as and be sold as chattel, or a slave. A third way that chattel slavery came to be, if it was an enticement of a contract, if it wasn't through a drummed up jail crime, was to be rounded up and deported. Once again, we hearken back to the Holocaust, absolutely, and the Cambodian Genocide to a degree as well. Local officials were often, so the police officers and the jefe politico and so forth, were often contracted by the area's hacienda to actually supply workers. Remember what we heard that quote? The quote was, killing them off, obey me, follow my orders, or I have carte blanche to kill you. We saw that that animals were more valuable than slaves because slaves were easily acquired. And so here we have haciendas contracting out the acquisition of workers, whether it be a slave or a peon, forced labor, whatever the term, and it was done by the local police, the local political structure. When people were scarce, when it was difficult to acquire them, the local police, the local jefe politico, and so forth, that organization actually grabbed young schoolboys, and they would sell them off, selling off human beings at the time 50 pesos. So we had that rural population of 12.7 million people in 1910. And it was estimated that there were approximately 750,000 chattel slaves just in the southern part of Mexico. There were possibly 100,000 alone on the Yucatan Peninsula. Overall, in 1910, this idea of debt bondage, working to pay off debt, may have enslaved as many as 5 million people, 5 million peons. So we're getting near a third anyway. A third of the population was indebted and therefore working as a peon. Is ethnic cleansing starting to emerge? It's possible. How many people died on these haciendas due to beatings, due to mistreatment, and due to murder? I don't think anyone will ever know. But that isn't necessarily ethnic cleansing. But where the ethnic cleansing idea might come in, again, not a legal definition, but something that we understand, where that might come in is with the indigenous Mexican Indians or indigenous people. I mean, it could just be outright racism. So, for example, this is a quote from one. Don Enrique Camara Zavala was a millionaire planter and was president of Camara de Agricola de Yucatan. And he said, quote, this is about the Yaquis. If the Yaquis last out the first year, they generally get along all right and make good workers. But the trouble is, at least 2/3 of them die off in the first 12 months. Now, is that targeting? Is it just using the Yaquis because they were accessible, or was it specifically to rid them? We may see that emerge. So what Turner found was, for example, in one hacienda, he found 2 individual Yaqui out of a batch of 200 who had been purchased 2 years earlier. So in 2 years, 198 of them died. One of those who had survived, actually, and this is graphic description, but he had half of one of his feet bitten off by insects. The general manager there on that particular hacienda said to Turner, quote, about the one surviving Yaqui with the foot issue, he said, quote, I expect I'll have to kill that tiger. He'll never be worth anything to me anymore. According to Turner, in the Yucatan, the Maya slaves died off faster than they were born. Now, was that intentional? And if so, that meets the definition. Actually meets the definition of genocide, though I'm not saying that was a genocide. So we see that the indigenous, the native Indians, the Yaqui and the Mayans were treated horribly. But that's not to say that non-native Mexicans weren't treated horribly as well. They were. One American boss of a large hacienda plantation near a place called Santa Lucrecia said, quote, I remember a lot, therefore a group of, I remember a lot of 300 enganchados who we received one spring. In less than 3 months, we buried more than half of them, end quote. In Valle Nacional, all of the slaves, all but a very few, perhaps 5%, passed back to Earth within the space of 7 or 8 months. And there are 15,000 of these Valle National slaves, 15,000 new ones every year. So this is a churning of human beings, these numbers that we're throwing around. 5%, so therefore 95% of them die within a 7 or 8 month period. 15,000 of these year after year after year. According to Turner, John Turner, Valle National was a horrible, horrible example, but not completely unlike others throughout Mexico. All right, to add a little more to this idea of Valle National and the brutality that they experienced, is a little bit of a quote. It's kind of long, but it certainly captures about the brutality. And if you'd like, I can email it to you if you request it. All right, so we were talking about how the 15,000 each year. And according to Turner, by the 6th or 7th month, they begin to die off like flies at the first winter frost. And after that, they're not worth keeping. The cheapest thing to do is to let them die. There are plenty more where they came from, end quote. So this was told to a foreman of Via National. Quote, I've been here for more than 5 years, and every month I see hundreds and sometimes thousands of men, women, and children start over the road to the valley, but I never see them come back. Of every 100 who go over the road, not more than one ever sees this town again. That was made by, that quote was by a railroad station agent who saw the people come and not leave. Another quote, there are no survivors of Via National, no real ones. This is according to a government engineer. Quote, now and then one gets out of the valley and gets beyond El Hul. He staggers and begs his way along the weary road toward Cordoba, but he never gets back where he came from. Those people come out of the valley walking corpses. They travel on a little way and then they fall, end quote. Another quote, they die, they all die. The bosses never let them go until they're dying. So that's what we're talking about. We're talking about walking corpses. We're talking about deportations. We're talking about the Holocaust. But this is in Mexico in the early 1900s. So there were deportations, especially the Indians or the native indigenous people. That was another bad aspect of the Mexican slave market. So for example, there was a rate of 500 per month of Yaqui who were seized and then deported to work on haciendas as slaves. That was actually before Porfirio Diaz, the authoritarian dictator of Mexico, still at the time, before he decreed that every Yaqui, wherever found, whatever age, were to be seized by the War Department and deported to the Yucatan Peninsula. Deportations were extremely dangerous because basically what we're talking about, the same thing with the Holocaust, deportations. Deportations and death marches is what this sounds like. So here's another quote on that idea of deportations. So most elderly people, women, and children were shipped from Guaymas to San Blas, then herded on foot over mountains to San Marcos, a journey of about 15 days. From there, they went by train to Mexico City and Veracruz, and then again by boat to Progreso. Between 10 and 20% usually died on the journey. Families were deliberately split up en route to break their spirit even further before they were sent to work on the henequen plantations. In February of 1908, one boatload of Yucatan-bound Yaquis committed mass suicide to avoid being sold into slavery. Colonel Francisco B. Cruz, in charge of the shipment, reported, quote, those Indians wanted to cheat us out of our commission money, and so they threw their children into the sea and jumped in after them. We lowered boats, but it was no use. They all went down before we got to them. So more shocking brutality. Of course, there are a few statistics kept on these deaths, on these death marches, on these deportations, on the slaves who, or probable slaves, who killed themselves and so forth. It's estimated that between 1900 and 1910, 800,000 deportees in total, comprised of Yaqui and Mayan native indigenous Indians, Mexican peons, and others, were probably killed by this system, this hacienda system. The estimates range from that 800,000 to as many as 2 million. But no one really knows, so it could be as low as 80,000 and up to 200,000. So anywhere between 80,000 and 2 million people. Regardless, it's a substantial number of individual human beings whose whose tragic lives were ended tragically, and in many cases, way too soon. To add more of the unbelievable to this situation under Diaz, under the stable, dictatorial, authoritarian, but stable governance of Porfirio Diaz, is the idea of acordada, A-C-O-R-D-A-D-A, acordada. Under Diaz, each Mexican state was assigned an attachment of acordada, which was a group of assassins, a select group of assassins. And it reminds me of a much smaller Einsatzgruppen from the Holocaust, of professional murderers, in this case, assassins. So personal enemies of the state governor, the area's governor, or local lead officials, the jefe politico, political opponents, critics, alleged criminals against whom there may or may not have been evidence, were quietly killed by these assassins. So this is how the Diaz government, and therefore cascaded down to the different state governments, kept control. They actually had these acordada. The son of a friend of Diaz was made a member of the acordada, the assassin group. He was given 2 assistants, and he was told to go quietly kill along the border. Who? He was to kill at his discretion anyone he thought was connected with the opposition. So this is an opposing liberal party. And the liberal party was based on agrarianism. So the social philosophy of owning land. So again, this goes back to the idea of land ownership. So here we have Diaz starting to have to fight against a movement of agrarianism, or people who want to own the land. It was also a party that was built on what is called anarcho-communism, whose goal was to rid the state, eliminate the state, to get rid of capitalism, was to get rid of wage labor, and to get rid of private ownership. So you had that along with this agrarian movement formed together to form a liberal party. And that liberal party was absolutely opposed to Diaz. Some killings were public and directly carried out by government officials. So for example, in 1909 at a town called Tihutzingo, there were 16 summary executions. This is under Diaz's leadership. At Valderrena, several people were shot in the street. Why? They were holding a parade in defiance of the local lead official, or the jefe politico. So several were shot in the street during the parade. Somewhere between 12 and 30 were forced to dig their own graves with their bare hands, and then were shot. Again, Holocaust, again, Cambodian genocide. So these are trends that are unfortunate, to say the least. In Hidalgo, a group of native indigenous Indians who resisted their land being appropriated, stolen, were buried up to their necks in that ground. So they fought to defend their ground. They were captured. They were buried up to their neck, and then the rural police, called the rurales, then galloped over them on horseback. Enemies and critics of Diaz, again, started in 1876, so it's inevitable that his authoritarian rule was finally going to be questioned. And so there were plenty of enemies and critics. Enemies and critics of Diaz became victims of a thing called ley fuga, ley fuga, L-E-Y-F-U-G-A, ley fuga, which was the law of flight. In other words, they were trying to escape. And so this was just an approved legal government-sponsored murder. A person was, so a rurales could capture someone, shoot them, and afterwards say they tried to escape. Under Diaz, there were at least 10,000 instances of this idea of ley fuga. So Diaz, under Diaz, between 1900 and 1910, ley fuga, that idea, and just a generalized terror, may have murdered as many as 30,000 political opponents, including police suspects, critics, alleged criminals, and so forth. Anyone who seemed to oppose Diaz's authoritarian rule, totalitarian rule. So who won out under Diaz was ultimately the rich and the powerful. They were protected. Those who went along with Diaz, including bureaucrats and officials, the upper middle class, wealthy landowners. Those who didn't, of course, were the lower class. And that seems to have been a substantial percentage of the population from what we saw. Under Diaz, workers were forbidden to strike. And speaking of workers, industrial workers weren't actually much better off. And so you have these haciendas, and you have factories and industrial setups, and you have the people seeing, from their perspective, foreign exploitation. You have wealthy Americans coming in and owning their land. So it's not surprising that in response to the authoritarian, totalitarian system of governance under Diaz, that a more Marxist type of movement would form to fight what they saw as injustice, exploitation. And so you can see why an agrarian land ownership for the people, anarcho-communist type of movement would form. So Diaz was corrupt, right? The army was run inefficiently. And so finally, the buildup finally got to the point where there were rebellions, plural rebellions. Ultimately, Diaz's demise was that many state governors and federal generals actually became almost independent of the central government. So Diaz was trying to run the government from him out, but the state governors and different federal generals as well became independent and tried to have a sense of independence from the central government. So that, along with the Liberal Party, really weakened Diaz's rule finally. The first spark of the Mexican Revolution was actually an insurrection that took place in the Yucatan Peninsula in a town called Valladolid, Villadolid, Valladolid. And to this day, there's a yearly fiesta or party to recognize the event, where they do a simulation of the battle and they place wreaths from where that battle took place. The one that actually worked was in the fall of 1910, and that was led by our next person up, Francisco Madero. Madero was upper middle class. So we see here we have Diaz in his military garb, his authoritarian military garb, and we see Madero in his business suit. Madero is upper middle class. He believed in liberal, lowercase L, constitutional government. And he was actually supported by the indigenous Indian population. He was supported by the peasants as well. And he was supported in the form of military generalship or leadership of Pancho Villa, who we'll see more of for sure. Madero won victories against Diaz's government forces and actually encouraged rebellions throughout the country. The revolt, or the revolution, began in 1910 in the fall, and then in May of 1911, Diaz fled and Madero took over. By at least 1910, right early on, one of Madero's leading generals, military minds, Pancho Villa, began to show disregard for human life, a trend of it. So, for example, now this is under Madero, so we've changed things up, right? We are having a more liberal approach, and so hopefully we're getting a change from the authoritarian violence and lack of respect for human life of Diaz to a new approach by Madero. However, under Villa, we don't see that. So in 1910, Villa captured the town of Torreon, and they killed 200 Chinese. Villa and his men hated the Chinese. I mentioned that earlier with the American journalist John Turner. So what it was, I honestly do not know. I didn't see any rationale for why they hated the Chinese, why so many of the people hated the Chinese, but they did. So 200 were murdered in the town of Torreon. In a way, that is, at the very least, an example of ethnic cleansing, as we know the working definitions, not legal, but working definitions. It sounds like ethnic cleansing. And on a very small scale, it seems like a genocide as well. We're not going to call it a genocide, but I think it's fair to call it ethnic cleansing. However, Villa was also equal opportunity when it came to his own troops. So to give you an idea of this man's character, fascinating. Villa was being interviewed by a U.S. journalist, not John Turner, but by a different journalist. And outside, there was a drunken soldier who was disturbing the interview. So during the conversation, Villa was talking with the journalist, removed his pistol, shot down from the window, and killed the man, and continued right on with the interview. So a disregard for even his own troops. His officers, Villa's officers, were horrible as well. One man called Fausto Borunda always killed prisoners. And if there were two prisoners, he would actually find civilians to kill. So he was looking for retribution wherever he went, this Borunda. When Villa's troops took Durango, this man Borunda went from saloon to saloon. He picked one man from each and asked them if they supported this opposition, a man we'll hear from named Huerta. If the man denied that he supported Huerta, he was accused of lying and was shot. Another notorious killer under Madero was Rodolfo Fierro. Fierro allegedly executed 300 prisoners by himself at one time. Apparently, he shot and shot and shot and paused because his trigger finger was sore, and then he continued on. There were lots of rebels, and these rebels under Madero were on a continuum from genuine revolutionaries to bandits and murderers. One rebel leader, for example, seized a coal train in a tunnel. He burned it and then waited for a passenger train to come along and run into it. Then he and the others looted the train of gold and valuables from the dead and dying passengers. Now that is, is that a revolutionary act, or is that banditry and murder? Madero's government was inefficient in making the changes that he wanted. So he had lofty ideals, but he was inefficient in getting them done. He temporarily, it was good at uniting forces, and he temporarily united anti-Diaz forces by gathering those people who were seeking democracy with a lowercase d. In fact, Madero had written a book back in 1908 called The Presidential Succession in 1910. Diaz had promised that he was not going to run after 1910, and he violated that promise. Madero stated that he wanted honest elections. In fact, he ran the anti-re-electionist party when Diaz reneged on the fact that he was not going to run again for the presidency. Well, during that election, Madero was arrested. He was released on bond and actually escaped from Mexico to San Antonio, Texas. Under Madero, a positive for sure was giving peasants the right to seek and air their grievances. Who do you think didn't like that? Was the elite and the wealthy, because that endangered their personal property, those massive holdings, those haciendas and those factories. So they didn't like it. The United States also didn't like Madero's changes because it was seen as threatening American investment. So Madero's time, as you can tell, is limited. All right, so a rebellion continued in San Antonio, and then extended into Chihuahua. Fighting continued to Ciudad Juarez, and the city was captured when Porfirio Diaz capitulated. So now we're up to 1911. 1911. Here we see a bunch of the leading lights that we'll see throughout this saga. So 1911 election went overwhelmingly for Madero, who had returned, but was quickly seen. Madero was quickly seen as too democratic with a lowercase d by what we would think of as the right, today's right, and was not radical enough for what we would see as today's left. There were 3 attempted coups against Madero. In fact, there was a full-blown military revolt led in Mexico City by his once trusted general, Victoriano Huerta, who we heard about just earlier. Huerta betrayed Madero. So here we see Carranza, a man we'll hear from shortly, Pancho Villa, the Maderos, Garibaldi's another player. Madero was arrested and assassinated during his escort to prison, which sounds like it harkens back to Porfirio Diaz's idea of la fuga. He was trying to escape. Though Madero his presidency would be construed as a failure, he actually became a symbol of the revolution. So these are the guys we saw from Ciudad Juarez after the first battle of Ciudad Juarez. We saw Huerta enter the picture, and by early 1913, Victoriana Huerta was in charge of the army in Mexico City, who rebelled and then joined up with others who were rebelling. And that's how they forced Madero to resign. Who do you suppose became president? Would be Victoriano Huerta. Here's an interesting map. This is a 1914 Rand McNally map. And it shows a breakdown of the separatist groups that had erupted throughout Mexico. They were trying to restore the Constitution by taking it to the field. Among them were Pancho Villa. I'm not sure why they call him Jose Villa. That was not his name, it's Francisco. Anyway, Pancho Villa and his troops were part of the civil war that broke out in the northern states. There was horrific violence, by the way, during this period. Federal forces were shot, and federal forces, when they captured rebels, shot them. They did not take prisoners. Down south, we have Emiliano Zapata, who organized a peasant revolt, and they demanded land reform. So here's that idea of that agrarianism once again, with maybe a touch of anarcho-communism coming to play. Zapata's forces included that full range of true revolutionaries through bandits and murderers as well. So for example, another example, an English widow fled Zapata's rebellion and later said, quote, "The Zapatistas treated all alike, masonry, dumb animals, and human beings," end quote. So there was no lack of violence now that Diaz is out of the picture, and now that Madero is out of the picture. A right and a left leaning person. Now we have Huerta installed. It doesn't affect any positive change, that's for sure. Violence is still the name of the game. So Huerta's presidency was just as awful as Madero's. It was just as inefficient. It was probably more repressive and was definitely dictatorial. In fact, part of his rule, according to what I read, is considered some of the most violent time period of the revolution. Another quote to paint a picture of the cruelty, the clever ingenuity, and to reflect back to the cover of Mexico Barbaro. Quote, this is regarding the Zapatistas. Captured landowners and army officers faced agonizing deaths at Zapata's hands. Some victims were crucified on telegraph poles or on giant cactus trees. Others were staked out over ants' nests and smeared with honey, or sewn up inside wet hides and left to suffocate as the hides dried in the sun. One of Zapata's favorite execution methods was to stake out a man on a rough framework of branches over the top of a fast-growing maguey cactus, Maguey, maguey cactus. During the night, the thorn-tipped blossom stalk of the plant would grow a foot or more, driving itself inch by inch through the staked-out victim. So there's that lack of respect for human life. There's that clever ingenuity, which seems to really make itself known with torture and murder. So now enter this growing instability, this display of violence, this tumult, this lack of respect for human life. Now we have President Woodrow Wilson of the United States enter the fray. And so we have Wilson embargoing military arms that were coming from Germany, from the Germans, that were to go to Huerta's troops. This actually leads to what we see pictured here, which is the takeover of Veracruz by the U.S. Navy. That the excuse was to stop the shipment of German arms that were going to Huerta. This is where we see the Tampico Affair, which actually triggers it. So the Tampico Affair is when U.S. soldiers went ashore to get fuel. They were on the dock, and for whatever reason, they were arrested. Did they go past where they were supposed to? Did they go out of bounds? I don't know. But anyway, it was an excuse to arrest them. American soldiers arrested by Mexico. Woodrow Wilson demanded an apology. President Huerta refused, leading to Veracruz, the affair in Veracruz. So the U.S. Navy did not allow Huerta those arms, but they did allow the arms to go through occupied Veracruz in July of 1914 and actually go to rebels who were fighting Huerta. All right, so August of 1914, we have a new character enter the fray, who we saw pictured here, and that is Venustiano Carranza. So we have Venustiano Carranza, who enters Mexico City. By the way, in October of this year, so it's August of 1914, in October, World War I begins. Anyway, August of 1914, Venustiano Carranza enters Mexico City, and Huerta resigns. He resigned in part because of this occupation, and also because of the military successes of Carranza. Carranza ends up occupying the presidency a month later, by September. Huerta then escapes into exile to Spain. And we'll see as president after president is toppled, we'll see exile or assassination. Got a list of the what happens to each at the end. So now there's an ideological picking of sides who supported the Mexican Constitution. These people were divided up. So now you've got Carranza in charge, embracing this Mexican Constitution, but people wanted to support different elements of it. And so that actually led to, by December of 1914, civil war. So the Civil War actually then rolled in 1915. That's December 1914 it begins. So the Civil War that begins essentially in 1915 pitted who were called conventionists. Those would include people like Zapata and Villa, versus constitutionalists, people like Carranza and Obregon. We will see Alvaro Obregon later on. So these are players. These are people who were very involved throughout this revolutionary period. Anyway, by the end of 1915, one of the rebels, Venustiano Carranza, had captured most of Mexico. So here you see Carranza, up here his name's cut off. You see the constitutionalists. So they'd captured a lot of this. Also, interestingly, on this map, you see the U.S. Navy, U.S. warships. Mexican warships, right here. You see forts in Texas along the border. You see garrisons, principal garrisons of the federal Mexican troops in the north. So you see a couple X's there to mark those spots. So interesting map. There's a lot going with this map. All right, so we were talking the rebel leaders, Zapata and Villa. Well, there were other rebel leaders who did not accept the terms. So we're having continued civil war with Zapata in the south and Villa in the north, and Carranza trying to bring together everything and controlling most of Mexico. But we have Villa and Zapata, among others, not gravitating that way yet. Carranza ordered, actually, a general named General Gonzalez to destroy what he called the Zapata rabble in a town called Morelos. And that was a town located outside of Mexico City. So General Gonzalez began to destroy the countryside. Another quote. All right, so here we have about General Gonzalez under Carranza and now going after Zapata. Zapata being a land reform, agrarian, or anarcho-communist. And here we have Carranza now turning on Zapata and the Zapata rabble, so-called. Immorales, Gonzalez, quote, systematically began to lay waste to a countryside which had already been ravaged by 7 years of civil war. Whole villages were burned, crops were destroyed, women and children were herded into detention camps, and every man Gonzalez could lay his hands on was hanged. The entire sugar industry of the state was wrecked as Gonzalez looted what factories and haciendas Zapata had left untouched. Even the huge copper vats in the distilleries were melted down and the metal sold. So more instability. Who's with who? It begins to become a mishmash of people, in some cases with slightly different approaches to what they wanted, slightly different results that they were seeking. Anyway, during the first 6 months of the rebellion, not one constitutionalist, see here, not one constitutionalist commander ended up in a prison. All were shot. Now, what this is civil war, and therefore shooting captured people is a war crime. So now, despite Diaz's authoritarian, totalitarian reign and death, it's as if things really exploded now. And so now we have instances of ethnic cleansing arise. Now we have instances of war crimes arising. There's more. In 1916, a new currency was put into circulation. So that suggests now that you have economic and monetary instability to add to it. So things are worsening, to say the least. State governors, many, not all, many state governors and federal generals as well became what they do refer to as warlords. They would levy their own taxes. They would refuse to forward money that was collected for the federal government to keep for themselves. In many cases, they ignored federal law. Some bandits became generals, looting areas that they controlled. Some generals became bandits as well. So it was a mishmash for sure. Even in the capital, high-ranking military officers looted and killed with impunity. Again, war crimes and possibly crimes against humanity, although it was in a war setting. Still, we have evidence of not genocide, but of the mass human rights violations rearing their head. In terms of numbers, the warlord phase may have killed as many as 400 to 500,000 people. This is over a 10-year span, and was under numerous leaders: Diaz, Madero, Huerta, and Carranza. So we'll say under that 10-year time frame, as many as 500,000 people were killed by this warlord bandit approach. Before and during the revolution, which we're now into, the idea of conscription was used. That is an absolute violation of what are called war crimes. So, for example, the jefe politico, the political leader, could decide who got drafted. Of course, graft and bribery could either get one out of it or buy your way out, or you could even have someone else fight in your stead. It's through graft and corruption. Those who criticize the regime, in this case we're under Carranza now, but had it been under Diaz, possibly under Madero, definitely under Huerta, and now under Carranza, those who criticize the regime or tried to do a work strike or angered officials in any way could end up being conscripted, required to serve in the army. So in a sense, the army served as a forced labor situation. In fact, it was nicknamed the National Chain Gang at one point, the army. And so in a way, that is crimes against humanity. So we see genocide, possibly crimes against humanity, absolutely. War crimes, yes. Ethnic cleansing, yes. We see all that emerging during this time of what led up to the Mexican Revolution, and included the Mexican Revolution. During this revolution, they even used press gang methods. So examples: 700 spectators at a bullfight were grabbed by the army and impressed, forced into service, military service. Another instance, 1,000 or so spectators had gathered. There was a huge fire going on in town, and they were observing it like anyone would do. It's a sight, and they're observing it. They were grabbed by the army. This included women. The men were forced to serve as soldiers. The women were forced to work in ammunition factories. A woman living in Mexico City at the time wrote, quote, "A friend told me this morning that the father, mother, 2 brothers, and sister of one of her servants were taken last week. They scarcely dare, any of them, to go out after dark. Posting a letter may mean literally going to the cannon's mouth." These soldiers who were impressed, they were forced to serve, weren't trained. They basically became, the cannon's mouth. They became fodder. They were given poor equipment, little to no training, and we'll see about food as well. So they were treated like fodder because they were criminals, because they were beggars, because they were native, indigenous Indians, because they were treated like fodder because there were replacements in the form of criminals, beggars, indigenous people, and peons. So again, it's this complete lack of respect for human life. Force people into the military, force them into situations where they'll most likely die, and they didn't care because you could force other people in as well. So it was a mill of just constantly forcing people to their death, to situations that could lead to their death, and this is a lack of respect for human life. Although that is not a United Nations category, this idea of lack of respect of human life, I think is important. So soldiers, we talked about food, medical care. So soldiers were generally not really given medical attention, medical care. The food was poor, and in part that was due to corruption of officers. So some people actually died of starvation and or disease. For example, before the revolution even began, in the territory of Quintana Roo, or I don't know, 2,000 to 3,000 troops in the field fighting the Maya Indians. All of those troops were considered political suspects. Per the government doctor who served there, he was the chief of sanitary service. During the, quote, during the first 2 years I was there, the death rate was 100% a year. For in that period, more than 4,000 soldiers died of starvation and sickness induced by, well, starvation. So they starved to death, or they died from disease that was ultimately induced by starvation. And that was induced by starvation because of the corruption of the officers. Quote, General Bravo steals the commissary money and starves the soldiers with the convenience of the federal government. More than 2,000 have died of acute starvation alone during the past 7 years since General Bravo took command, end quote. So this corruption, this sense of corruption that we saw, starting with Diaz, has gone all the way through to Carranza. And now with this sense of revolution and civil war, the instability is there. And that's why we see warlord mentality, people grabbing what they can for themselves. When rebels captured a town, they often, this is sexual assault was rampant. So they raped at will. The US ambassador reported in the town of Durango that 50 women of, quote, good family, end quote, killed themselves after being raped. When rebels captured Mexico City back in 1914, they pillaged and they killed police. Pancho Villa, allegedly, quote, forced his intentions on a French woman, which led to an international incident, end quote. The U.S. State Department learned that 150 accused of political crimes were shot. So basically what was happening was the rebels were imposing their own sense of criminal justice. And these are images from that time period in Mexico, executions. So the rebels were imposing their own criminal justice. For example, Zapata's men hanged 3 men outside a police station. Around one, they hung the sign, thief. Around a second, they hung a sign, counterfeiter. Around the third, they wrote, killed by mistake. A complete lack of respect for human life. So while Zapata's men were hanging, Villa's soldiers seemed to be more bullet-oriented, shooting suspected spies, counter-revolutionaries. In fact, anyone who made a slur against Villa or hit the uniform or the president that he was supporting at the moment could be shot. Innocents were caught up all the time. A British author named Charlotte Cameron was in the Capitol and wrote, quote, you may go out 50 times and nothing happens. Yet the 51st time, your life may be forfeited, end quote. So this is all under Carranza. Carranza ruled until 1920. He instituted a radical liberal constitution. Now we saw on the map Carranza and the Constitutionalists. So we may get that confused with the United States Constitution, and most of us wouldn't think it was liberal. This was a liberal constitution, which was actually later adopted by subsequent leadership. But Carranza didn't succeed in bringing forth the reforms he promised. He was supported by Villa and Zapata. Villa and Zapata were the agrarian, anarcho-communist, land-oriented people. So Carranza was then, not surprisingly, overthrown. In 1920, he was overthrown by the man I mentioned earlier, Alvaro Obregon. Obregon was a very efficient general who became president. He used the dictatorial approach to provide stability, at least relative stability, brought about some order and some changes. Now, I mentioned earlier about another racial aspect. So we saw a racial aspect towards the Mayan and Yaqui Indian or Native Indigenous people. We also saw a small racial element towards the Chinese. But here's the third one that's very interesting. I mentioned the Plan of San Diego, iterations 1, 2, and 3. This revolution led to emigration. Not everyone, but the revolution was everywhere. And of course, with life being not revered as much as we would hope, some people said we need to leave. So they emigrated. Of course, they emigrated along the Mexico-Texas border to Texas and California and into America. All right, so immigrants to Texas included political refugees, genuine political refugees, illegal aliens, and that led to an influx of people, and it led to some kind of chaos in Texas anyway. And that chaos, at least to some people, sparked an idea in some of these revolutionaries. They figured with this sense of chaos that this might be a great time to seize momentum and force an initiative. So the Plan of San Diego does not refer to San Diego, California, but a small town in Texas, San Diego, Texas. And the plan was a revolutionary manifesto that was probably written in a jail in Monterrey. There may have been support from the Carranza government, however. Was it genuine, or was it political, or was it expedient, and maybe a little of both? I don't know, but it's an interesting idea. The goals of the Plan of San Diego were to create a liberating army that was based on race. The composition of the army was to be Mexican Americans, African Americans, Japanese, not Chinese, but Japanese. So again, the differentiation, it wasn't based on Asia, it was based on something else, maybe skin color. Anyway, Mexican Americans, African Americans, Japanese, and the goal was to free Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, California, and Colorado, to form them into a new nation with the longer term possible goal of being reuniting or being annexed by Mexico in the future. So the plan was supposed to go, quote, on the 20th day of February, 1915, at 2 o'clock in the morning, we will arise in arms against the government and country of the United States of North America, one as all and all as one, proclaiming the liberty of individuals, of the black race, and its independence of Yankee tyranny, which has held us in iniquitous slavery since remote times, end quote. The rules of war were: A, no quarter was to be given; B, the summary execution of all males 16 or older. There's that age again of 16. We saw that in the Cambodian Genocide. The age 16 was important. We see that in the United Nations definition, where it's actually 15, 16, about being conscripted. So the summary execution of males 16 or older, and it was to begin on February 20th, 1915. As it turned out, a copy of the plan was found after a participant was arrested. So they were able to take the plan, and so no action was actually taken. Instead, what they did was the originators of this plan produced an updated version. So the Plan of San Diego 2. Plan 2's goals were to liberate the, quote, proletariat. So that brings in that anarcho-communist kind of Marxist idea, the proletariat, to liberate them. Its focus was going to be just on Texas, however, not the other states. It was then going to use Texas as a base of operation to foment revolution in those other southwestern states that we mentioned: New Mexico, Colorado, California, and so forth. And now it included American Indians or Native Americans as well to the group. So plans 1 and 2 were considered by some as being just emoting feelings of what people maybe could dream of, but it wasn't an actual plan. However, the Rio Grande Valley in Texas actually saw raids that coincided, that began in July of 1915. So those included with the second plan's tactics. So was it just emoting? Was it just a philosophical idea, a thought experiment, or was it practical and hands-on? Well, we do see guerrilla tactics being used along the Texas-Mexico border, and they were to disrupt communications and transportation along the border. We see raids led by 2 Carranza men. One was a general. We also see a couple of South Texas residents who were involved in raids, and this is all under Carranza's watch. There is an unknown number of what would have been, from the Mexican perspective, would have been called Anglos and GLOS. So an unknown number of Anglos were killed, and in response, the United States moved army reinforcements to the area. That's in response to the Plan of San Diego 2. Plan of San Diego 3, slightly different from the first 2. It determined to form a nation called the Republic of Texas. That was going to include, of course, Texas proper, along with New Mexico and California and Arizona, so it makes sense, but also parts of Oklahoma and Mississippi. The tactics in this third plan were to include raids from both sides of the border. But then, prior to that, the United States recognized Carranza as the president, and so suddenly the raids stopped. And that's why I'm saying, I'm wondering how much of this was politically expedient versus really trying to generate a race war. However, then the relationship between the United States and Carranza soured, and so the raids commenced. So for example, the biggest example is Pancho Villa raiding the United States. Villa and others invaded, or raided rather, Columbus, New Mexico, March of 1916. There are 500 mounted men. So they set buildings on fire. They attacked civilians, they attacked soldiers, and in the end, 10 U.S. civilians were killed, and 8 U.S. soldiers were killed as well. And approximately 80 of Villa's men were also were killed in that skirmish. So how did the United States respond? Well, the U.S. sent General John J. Blackjack Pershing, along with 140 National Guard soldiers to the border. So the National Guard soldiers were federalized. They were sent to the border in Mexico, and then not the National Guard, but Pershing and the regular army into Mexico proper in what is called the punitive expedition. They were looking to punish Villa. The Plan of San Diego raids actually recommenced in May of 1916, and Mexican officials actually considered adding regular army, Mexican army forces along to the raiders to attack Laredo, Texas. Thankfully, the United States and Mexico settled differences in June of 1916. So the results of the plans of San Diego 1, 2, and 3. Well, really, there were a small number of fatalities. There were thefts. There were kidnappings. There was a U.S. soldier who was kidnapped, who was tortured. He was beheaded, and his head was placed on a pole overlooking the border. There was also the incident of a train with American miners being stopped in Mexico. 18 Americans actually were ordered off the train. 17 were killed. However, in a way, the plans that were to inspire a race war against the Anglos actually backfired. It actually led to, in Texas especially, as many as 300 or so Mexicans or Mexican Americans to be killed. It also had a negative local economic effect, a very negative one as well. So, and that's just a real brief, quick overview of these plans, but they're interesting. But so does this plan of San Diego 1, 2, and 3, does that reflect ethnic cleansing? Or in a way, does it suggest or reflect attempted genocide? I mean, it was Anglos or whites who were to be targeted by, we would say, people of color. Japanese, Mexicans, Mexican Americans, African Americans, and then later Native Americans. It did backfire, however, and it turned out that actually Mexican and Mexican Americans were the ones targeted. So were they targeted for their ethnicity? The Mexicans and the Mexican Americans, were they targeted for their ethnicity, or were they targeted because they were participating in this plan because they were revolting against America? I don't know. But I do know that extra legal executions became common, lynching and so forth. In fact, became so common that a reporter in San Antonio, talking about the deaths that were taking place, he observed that the finding of dead bodies of Mexicans has reached a point where it creates little to no interest. So that's how commonplace it had become. So we said approximately 300 Mexican Americans were killed in retribution of the plan of San Diego 1, 2, and 3. So an interesting question is, did this plan influence the Zimmerman telegram? And that's one interesting departure that might generate an idea for an activity or a research project, is linking the plan of San Diego 1, 2, and 3 to the Zimmerman telegram to look for commonalities and differences. So that's an option. There are others, however, as well. And this picture is interesting. This is a picture of the 1st Aero Division of the United States, the Air Force, what would become the Air Force later on, juxtaposed against soldiers on horseback. It's a neat picture. The Zimmerman telegram. You see it in code on the left. You see it on the right. You see it translated, and you see, if you look closely, that this was about Germany getting Mexico to participate in a invasion of the United States to reconquer lost territory in Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. And the details are going to be left to them. So interesting parallel along with the plan of San Diego. Some topics, some departures that are interesting that might be good for activities. Aside from incredible political cartoons, this idea of Veracruz that we looked at very, very briefly, the photograph of the U.S. ships in massive numbers attacking and occupying part of Mexico in an undeclared war. The Zimmerman telegram, the border wars, the 1st Aero Squadron, that's that photograph. That could generate an interesting research project. A neat activity, I think, with a photograph activity, because that picture is incredible. Revolutionaries and characters. There's no limit to the revolutionaries and amazing characters. Pancho Villa and Zapata, and to name a few. This idea of Tejana musica Tejana, concept of immigration at the time, immigration. The fact that George S. Patton was actually involved in the punitive expedition. What we saw sort of at the beginning with the soldaderas, this idea of radical feminism, and also the art and murals, incredible amount of art work and murals that go back to this revolutionary period. And I mentioned political cartoons as well. So some really neat ideas for activities. I talked about providing a summary because we're hitting on just briefly on these people, but to give you an idea of the presidents and their reign, their stability or instability, and what happened to them ultimately. Diaz, we said, Porfirio Diaz, we said, was president from 1876 to 1910. Absolute stability. He ended up resigning and going into exile. Madero was president for just 2 years, 1911 to 1913. He was executed. Huerta was president for just from 1913 to 1914. He resigned and went into exile. Carranza was president from 1914 up to 1920, and the end of the revolution. He was assassinated. Alvaro Obregon became president in 1920, lasted to 1924. We didn't go into that, but he was assassinated. A couple of the revolutionaries that we talked about, the big ones, Pancho Villa and Emiliano Zapata. Villa was assassinated by the man who would become president in 1920, Obregon. Emiliano Zapata was ambushed and killed by Carranza. It shows a great deal of instability, to say the least. I think it's obvious that instability is an element of what could possibly lead to mass human rights violations and genocide. All right, we're going to take a look at this tracker that we've been using with the Cambodian genocide, and now we're here to Mexico. So we looked at the event name. This is just a name I came up with to kind of give an overview of the person. So we'll call it the Hacienda period. That's under Diaz from 1876 to 1910. He was an authoritarian dictator, and I think if we had to put him on today's left or right paradigm, I think it would be fair to say that he is on the right, according to these, and this is sort of generalized or stereotypical in a way when we do these left rights. The name of the country, it doesn't change for our purposes here. For Cambodia, it did. It was the Khmer Republic, then the Democratic Kampuchea, and then back to Cambodia. For our purposes, for Mexico, it was always Mexico. Was Diaz authoritarian or totalitarian? Absolutely. The approximate numbers killed, can't say specifically, a substantial number under Diaz. Was there a genocide? Well, there's no genocide when we talk about Mexico and the Mexican Revolution. However, was there one intended against the Yaqui Mayan people? Possibly, but it doesn't meet the actual definition. So we're going to just say maybe it was intended with a question mark. Were there crimes against humanity under Diaz? Absolutely. Were there war crimes? Most likely. Was there ethnic cleansing? I would say so. So if it wasn't genocide, it was definitely ethnic cleansing. The second period would be the coup, and this is from 1911 to 1913, and this is going to be under Madero, who was a democratic socialist, who we would consider under today's left-right paradigm as left. Was he totalitarian? We'll say no. Again, the numbers of killed, impossible to know. Did he attempt to perpetrate genocide? No. Were there crimes against humanity? Think back to under Villa and Zapata. Absolutely. Were there war crimes since it was a civil war period? Absolutely. Under him, Villa and Zapata. Ethnic cleansing, we're going to say no on that. Third period, a period of rebellion. This is 1913 and 1914, the military despotism of Huerta. We don't really know, and a military despot, I think, in today's left-right paradigm could be either. So let's just put him as either. Was he totalitarian? Yes. And so that's more of the key. Victoriana Huerta, we can't attribute specific numbers. There were many killed. We said his period especially was maybe some of the most violent of this revolutionary period. Was it an attempted genocide under him? I don't believe so. Were there crimes against humanity? Yes. War crimes? Yes. Ethnic cleansing? We'll say no. A fourth period between this 1900 and 1920, a fourth period, we'll call it the constitutional period, from 1914 to 1920. It was constitutionalist. It was a socialist constitution, as we saw. Therefore, we'll say he's under today's left-right paradigm, left. Not totalitarian. This is under Venustiano Carranza. Again, cannot attribute specific numbers. No, a genocide was not intended. Most likely crimes against humanity and war crimes were. So we see a trend there. And then we'll call this last period that we really don't go into, we just broach, a quasi-stable period. That's from 1920 to 1924. Interestingly, this is Obregon, who rules from that time period, then attempts to get back involved in, I think, 1928, and he's assassinated. So he was authoritarian, a labor party, but some stability. Because he was the labor side of things, we'll call him left. And yes, totalitarian. So again, deaths under Obregon we can't attribute. Genocide, no. Crimes against humanity, no. War crimes, no. And ethnic cleansing, no. That's because we don't broach the subject with him. I can't say for sure. From 1910 to 1920, this is that revolution period. This does not include combat deaths. There were at least 145,000 who died from conscription and army servitude, just in the military context. The numbers, the range is huge. It could have been as many as 2 to 3 million people who died in the Mexican Revolution, but that would be due to battle, massacre, starvation, disease. It could be as many as 3 million. I saw something that said 1.2 million probably died from influenza and typhus. How many died due to peonage and chattel slavery? Maybe 82,000, but we've seen huge, broad swaths of a range of numbers of people killed. Due to conscription, 14,000. Deportations, 30,000. Massacres and military executions, perhaps 30,000. The pre-Civil War period, perhaps 388,000. During the warlord period of the rebels and the bandits, maybe 42,000. During the Civil War, which would have included some of that, so there's tons of overlap, 335,000. The numbers between 1900 and 1920 of Mexico and the Mexican Revolutionary period, something between 600,000 and 3.3 million people killed. And so this number 1.4 is a fair, not that accurate number, but we can say 1.4 million people. All right, so if we look at this, we see, if we include Cambodia, we see that the idea of genocide is something that's very, very specific and has very specific criteria. But we see that crimes against humanity seems to be much more commonplace. We see that the 4 different phases of Cambodia, we see a yes, a maybe, and a yes. Here in the Mexican Revolution, yes, 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 most likely, and no. In the context of war, we see yes, 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 and maybe in Cambodia. We see likely, yes, 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 and no in Mexico. Ethnic cleansing is a lot less. And so what's really emerging here is that genocide seems, because it's so substantial, seems to be very specific and not as likely, thankfully. We see ethnic cleansing as not as likely, but that's probably because there's not a legal definition. But we do see crimes against humanity and war crimes as a very, seemingly very commonplace event, for what it's worth. So that trend is, I think, starting to emerge. We see a trend starting to emerge. I do want to conclude with thanking the task force, the Commissioner's Task Force on Holocaust Education, and the Merrill Color Educator Series for all of their support, all of their help. And I'd like to thank you for being here. If you did take the time to go through this talk, thank you. If you would let me know by email that you did, I would really appreciate it. Again, if you could email me, my name is Sam. It will be sam@hmcec.org. That's sam@hmcec.org. If you could let me know that you attended the Mexico and Mexican Revolution workshop series, I'd appreciate it. Let me know your name, the date, the institution with which you're affiliated, if you are affiliated with one. It would really help, because we do track for the task force, and the Mural Color Educator Series. Next up, so this will be effective, this Mexico and Mexican Revolution video will be effective September 1st, along with links to websites that I think are very interesting, provide interesting background, interesting subject matter, fascinating pictures, the YouTube video about the song Los Adelitas, the translation from Spanish to English is there as well, and the video will be up. All that will be up effective September 1st. Next up behind, or after this one, will be effective October 1st, is going to be on Yugoslavia. So now we're going back to Tito and during the Holocaust, contemporaneous with the Holocaust. So we will look into that. Please let me know if you have any questions. Please let me know if you attended this. If you need anything from me, let me know. Again, sam@hmcec.org. The Holocaust Museum and Cohen Education Center, thank you so much, and we will see you next time.